Throughout automotive history, concept cars have served multiple purposes. Sometimes they're meant to show off the automaker's design and styling chops. At other times, they're meant to kind of inspire the general public about what the future of cars could be. At other times, they're meant to inspire the people working for that automaker to make cool stuff. On rare occasions, a concept car would shape, future production models or even become a future production car. Think the Dodge Viper or the Lexus LFLC. Concept cars give you this kind of unique look into what the major manufacturers are capable of when they sort of throw off all the bureaucratic crap and have complete freedom to just sort of make whatever they want. At times throughout automotive history, investing heavily into concept cars has made sense. Sadly, at other times, it hasn't made sense for automakers, and unfortunately, we're kind of in one of those periods. So I'm hoping that looking at this topic will kind of inspire some people out there. Maybe if you work for, say, GM, go to your boss and show them this video, because you guys used to make really cool stuff, and a lot of it's pretty boring as of late. Let's take a look back at the history of concept cars, how we came up with this idea of kind of making dream cars, so to speak, and is there a future for this going forward? Now, I cannot give enough credit to this book by Larry Edsel. It is fantastic. It covers the complete history of concept cars. Honestly, I have read a ton of automotive books. I've got them all right here, and it might be my favorite book I've ever read just on automotive history. So definitely check it out. I'll link it so that you guys can buy it if you want to support him and if you want to learn more. All right, if you're out there and you're a fight fan, you know that UFC 318 is right here. And if you're anything like me, you've already got your picks lined up. Have I told you guys that I'm a UFC fan? I don't even know if I've ever mentioned that in my videos. We have Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway fighting, two absolute legends and also two brawlers. Personally, I think Max Holloway is going to win. Now, I'm no expert, but that guy doesn't age and can absolutely take a beating. So this is going to be really interesting. There's no better way to feel the intensity of a fight than with my partner, DraftKings Sportbook, the official sports betting partner of the UFC. Now listen up if you're a new customer. When you sign up and bet just $5, you instantly get $150 in bonus bets. That's right, bet 5, get 150 instantly. It's a great way to really get into the fight without breaking the bank. Just make sure to use my code CARSTORIES when you sign up. DraftKings is super easy to use. You can bet live during the fights, check odds in real time, and even stack bets with their same game parlays. Whether you're somebody who bets with your head or with your heart, you'll find something to love. So gear up for UFC 318. Download DraftKings Sportbook using the link below and use Car Stories and put your fight IQ to the test. All right, let's jump back into the video. Now, I mean no offense to early car designers when I say that it took a while for cars to really be more than just basically giant boxes on wheels, at least in terms of design. The idea for the concept car and building these kind of dream cars really came about with manufacturers experimenting with wind tunnel testing. Early experimental aerodynamic cars include, of course, Chrysler's Airflow series and Cadillac's Aerodynamic Coupe. But really the first full-fledged concept car meant to be futuristic and to be inspirational was the Buick Y Job, designed by Harley Earl. What made this car really unique was that it was wholly conceptual. It wasn't just, a production car with a little bit of aerodynamics thrown in or with some odd features. It was built from the ground up to be a concept, and it was meant to point to cars of the future. Its styling was dramatic. This car had so much flair for cars at this time. I mean, it's crazy to look at now, but this car was insanity for 1938. It was also predictive. It had things like pop-up headlights, an electric convertible top. GM only made one example, and Harley Earl actually went on to own and drive this car. Now, it's safe to say that the whole appeal of concept cars, it really all started with this thing. As the 40s got underway, Chrysler decided to get in on this whole concept car thing and take things further than they had with the Airflow, with a fleet of vehicles, the first of which was known as the Thunderbolt, advertised also as the car of the future. Now, these cars weren't the cars of the future, but you know what? That's okay. That's not the the point. They did have some really futuristic bits of design, things like almost, being completely fenderless. But the overall shape of this car didn't really catch on for production cars going forward, especially the whole strange double windshield thing. But I do think that with this car, Chrysler really paved the way for themselves as a company to be a manufacturer of at least somewhat cool cars. The great Italian designer Pininfarina used concept car designs to really make a name for themselves at this time. The Cisitalia 202 is a great example, not a pure concept car like what was coming out of America, more of just a production show car. Still, this was a landmark for design. I mean, how many iconic cars, especially from Europe, would come after this that looked so similar? Now, it's pretty clear what futuristic design meant for automakers in the 30s and 40s. It was all about streamlining and aerodynamics. And of course, they were right, though, aerodynamics would change quite a bit for cars. That would become the focus. And you have to wonder if later cars, like, for example, the Jaguar XK120, would that car exist without some of these other early flowy, streamlined vehicles. The 40s brought on a few other notable concept cars, but it was really the 1950s where things got crazy. American manufacturers, and Americans in general, had lots of money, and the future was bright, literally bright, from all the chrome. Now, before you look at a whole bunch of concept cars from the 50s, I think it's important to understand a few things just to kind of make sense of what we're even looking at. And the best way to make sense of these cars is to look to the sky. I think if you spend a lot of time looking at automotive history, it's easy to assume that no other industry advanced quite as much as cars and also motorcycles from, the early 1900s to the middle of the century. But in all reality, it's actually aviation and aeronautical technology that advanced quite a bit faster. I mean, we went from nothing at the turn of the century in terms of airplanes to full-on commercial airplanes and jets, and just a few decades after this, literally going to the moon. So if at this time in the 1950s, car makers were looking to the future, the aviation industry kind of felt like it was already in the future, and that would influence a lot of design at this time. Now, many of these kinds of cars would make their debut at the 1949 Motorama event hosted by GM. If you can imagine the hype around, say, like a gaming convention, this is what that was like, except for cars. Nothing like this had ever happened, and in many ways, nothing like it would ever happen again. So many crazy cars would come out of this event through the 1950s. Cars like the LeSabre, another car that was designed by Harley Earl, and it had things like 12-volt electrics and heated seats, and it used exotic materials. The Pontiac Bonneville Special, all of the GM Firebirds, the freaking Corvette. These cars embodied the true spirit of the concept car. Advanced design and engineering, creative freedom, wildly just impractical cars made with a total lack of concern for production constraints. The American automotive industry wouldn't be what it is today without this event. So many of these cars had features and bits of tech that wouldn't show up on cars for decades later. Backup cameras, keyless entry, autonomous driving, turbine engines. This was stuff that seemed like science fiction to people at the time, but many of these things would make it to real production cars and into the real world. The sense you get when you look at these concept cars from the 1950s, for example, the Firebird and its iterations looking like an absolute jet on wheels, was this sense of hopefulness among people at this time. They were looking to the future, and the future looked really bright. But as we'll see, looking through the history of concept cars, when the future looks really bright, that's when they invest in really cool, interesting stuff. And then when it's looking a little more bleak, that's when they all kind of stop making really cool concept cars. Now, it wasn't just GM making concept cars, though I think they are kind of the standout from this time. Chrysler, in partnership with Ghia, the famed Italian coach builder, created masterpieces like the K310, the De Elegance, and the Fire Arrow. And Lincoln made the Futura, the car that would later become the Batmobile. I think it's also worth noting that Italy's Bertone and Pininfarina would create some of the most influential car designs for concept cars and also for production cars in these early years. People like Giugiaro, Gandini, so many brilliant designers making not only European cars but even American cars. Cars like the Bart 1500 by Posto, Alfa Romeo's BAT 5, 7, and 9, the Superflow series, so many cool but also important and influential concept cars from the 50s came from Italian designers. And the sense you get as you look at Italian-designed concept cars from this time is just a little bit different than when you look at the American cars. American concept cars look, very futuristic and kind of hopeful, but Italian concept cars at this time, they felt like weirdly predictive of the future. And it would be true. Many of these companies would design cars that shaped the near future. And, this shouldn't be surprising. Italian designers have always been doing this. By the 1960s, concept cars began to evolve, the jet age design of the 50s was out the door, and there was a new obsession, the space age. And so a lot of the, curvaceous design language of the 1960s was kind of out the door for concept cars, and we started to get these more minimalist, space age sci-fi designs that looked more like something out of Star Trek. And this brought about the famous wedge designs, and the most famous being the 1968 Alfa Romeo Carrabbo, designed by Gandini at Bertone. This car was radically shaped like a block of Swiss cheese. And it would influence everything from the Lancia Stratos Zero to the Lotus Esprit to the Lamborghini Countach to the Triumph TR7. Pininfarina didn't want to be outdone, so they produced radical shapes like the Ferrari Modulo, which was like a UFO on wheels with partially covered tires and an interior that looked like a moonlander. But while design was really peaking in many ways at this time, optimism was fading, especially in America. The 60s turned into the 70s, and then there was the oil crisis, and the desire to make radical concept cars was kind of put to the wayside. Manufacturers had to get practical and boring. Now, concept cars kind of came back in the 80s and 90s, but at this time they were more like laboratories. Computers were becoming part of daily life, and so cars started reflecting that. Aerodynamics were also back at this time, but now it was more for fuel efficiency. Interiors began to look like Star Trek consoles. You had touchscreens, not because they were useful, but because, just because. Digital dashboards, early heads-up displays. The dream cars of this era were less about form and more about function. Brands like Toyota and Mazda made forward-thinking concepts like the AXV, the MX-03, the RX-500. These were cars that hinted at future bits of tech, things like hybrid technology and regenerative braking. The Pontiac Banshee, the Ford Ghia Via, and Chrysler's Portofino teased futuristic dashboards and cab-forward silhouettes. Now, at this time, concept cars were still used to kind of get the general public excited, but they were more used to try to tease out what people wanted. And this made it so that there were less really interesting concept cars as compared to the 50s and 60s. Now, there were some really interesting concept cars like the Chrysler Atlantic, which was all about blending 1930s Art Deco with modern engineering, but it was kind of becoming clear that concept cars were more serving corporate goals than just inspiration. But still at this time, there were glimpses of hope. Every once in a while, a concept car would come along that was so good, it would actually become a production car, and that's exactly what happened with the Dodge Viper. The Viper was a concept car unveiled at the 1989 North American International Auto Show, and the reaction was explosive. It was aggressive, it was low and wide, the styling was radical, and it was just this analog beast of a sports car. No traction control, no ABS, no frills really, just a massive V10 and a radical design. And Chrysler, every once in a while, brings out the old Chrysler, and this was one of those moments. They were just like, screw it. We're making it. By 1992, the Viper RT10 was on the road, and it felt like a concept car still. It wasn't very refined. It wasn't practical. It was just brutal and a little unhinged and maybe a little dangerous, which is exactly why people loved it. And the Viper would stand as kind of a reminder of what could happen when a manufacturer actually listens to the excitement around a concept car. The Viper was arguably the last car that was just made to be cool. Now, by the 2000s, sadly, automakers had kind of figured out a formula for concept cars. They would make them look about 90% ready for production. They would have wild LED lighting and impossible interiors, but it was all just there for show. But this like wild creativity from the 1950s was completely gone at this point. There was the Cadillac 16, which was a crazy concept car from this time. 16 cylinders, 1,000 horsepower, and just a nutso design. There was the Toyota FTHS and the Lexus LFLC. These were cars that influenced or kind of made it to production. So concept cars at this time, they still led to cool cars, but fewer and fewer of them were about wowing crowds. It was less about, look what we can do, and more about, hey, this is what's going to be coming in a few years, just with different mirrors. And that brings us to today. It's not that concept cars are completely dead at this point. It's just that they don't feel very alive. You know, now we get crossovers with some LED light bar and some sort of ridiculous screen going across the entire dash, and a bunch of buzzwords about sustainability and whatever, but there's no wow anymore. Now, I know it's more on the motorcycle side, but Kawasaki did just unveil a concept robotic horse that's pretty cool. You should check it out. Now, one of the problems when you compare today to like the 1950s, not just for concept cars, but also some of the great iconic production cars, is that we don't have these sort of renegade designers anymore. It used to be that there would be this one guy who was just incredible at designing, and companies would put all their trust in them. They would let them completely guide the design, and that's how you got so many awesome iconic cars and so many cool concept cars. Today, it feels a lot more like concept cars are coming out of the boardroom. And it's sad because we know these companies have lots of great, brilliant engineers and designers who could make really cool stuff, but it seems like the companies aren't letting them. Now, that's not to say we haven't gotten a few modern gems. There is the Hyundai Envision 74, which is maybe the most exciting concept car of the last decade, and one of the only cool retro designs for cars that I think I've ever seen. There's also the Renault R5 Turbo 3E, the Mercedes EQ Silver Arrow, and I do think we have to mention the Cybertruck, because it certainly feels like a concept car that somehow made it to production. And I will say, as much as I've hated on the Cybertruck, I do give them props for at least making something different. But yeah, it's pretty clear the golden age of concept cars, it's over. It's done. And it's probably never coming back. And it stinks because concept cars used to really matter. You know, when GM or some other company would make a radical, wild concept car, it felt like they were not being corporate for a moment, if that makes sense. And they were trying to present a future that you could almost touch. But today, concept cars, I don't know, they just feel lazy. And they're very much a product of just how much the automotive industry has changed since the 1950s. So even if I am asking for more companies to make more cool, interesting concept cars, and for them to kind of show us what the future could be beyond just, you know, giant touchscreens and stuff like that, I don't know, maybe that's ridiculous because there's not really any way for the automotive industry to go back to the way it was in the 50s. Now, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, so if you want, leave a comment below, like the video if you want to, you don't have to, or subscribe, but you also don't have to, because if you watch this video, all my other crap is probably going to get suggested to you anyways. Okay, we'll see you guys in the next one. Drive safe.